when a woman carrying a battered cardboard portfolio walked into the most prestigious fashion competition in Canada, nobody in that gleaming Toronto ballroom gave her a second glance. And the few who did looked away quickly, the way people do when they don't want to be caught staring at something that doesn't belong. The annual Meridian Fashion Innovation Prize drew every major name in Canadian design. The venue, the Fairmont Royal York's Grand Ballroom, had been transformed into something that looked more like an art installation than a competition hall. Racks of garments and protective covers lined the perimeter. Teams of designers moved in clusters, adjusting, consulting, photographing their work with the anxious energy of people who had been preparing for this moment for years. Fiona Calloway stood near the registration desk in a winter coat that had seen too many Canadian winters. She was 41, with the kind of face that people described as pleasant when they meant unremarkable, and hands that told a more complicated story. Calloused at the fingertips, stained faintly at the knuckles in a way that no amount of scrubbing ever fully fixed. She held her portfolio against her chest, like it was something she didn't want anyone to see, which was perhaps the worst possible posture for someone about to show it to judges. The woman behind the registration desk processed her paperwork with professional efficiency, though her eyes drifted twice to the portfolio, specifically to the strip of packing tape holding one corner together. "You're in the artisan category," the woman said, handing back a lanyard. "Presentation begins at 2. You'll have 12 minutes with the panel." Fiona thanked her and stepped aside to let the next participant through. She had driven 7 hours from Rivière-du-Loup to be here. Her van needed new brake pads and the heating on the passenger side didn't work, so her 8-year-old daughter Rosie had spent the last 2 hours of the trip bundled in a sleeping bag in the back seat, doing her homework by the light of a clip-on reading lamp and asking, every 40 minutes, whether they were almost there. Rosie was here now, standing a few feet away and pressing her nose against the glass of a display case containing a runway garment that probably cost more than Fiona's monthly rent. The dress was a pale architectural thing, structured silk in 3 panels, the kind of garment that existed to be photographed rather than worn. "It's not as nice as yours," Rosie said without turning around. "You haven't seen mine yet. I've seen you make it." Rosie finally pulled back from the glass. There was a faint circle of fog from her breath. "That's the same thing." It was not the same thing, but Fiona didn't say so. She took Rosie's hand and they moved deeper into the ballroom. The looks started almost immediately. Not hostile exactly, more the particular kind of confusion that registers when something genuinely doesn't fit the expected pattern. A team of designers from a Vancouver atelier stopped their conversation mid-sentence as Fiona passed. A man in a tailored blazer with a label lanyard around his neck glanced from her coat to the battered portfolio and back again, the mental math visible on his face. Fiona had spent 20 years doing alterations and custom dressmaking out of a converted shed behind her house in Rivière-du-Loup. She had learned to cut patterns from her grandmother, a woman who had emigrated from Portugal with almost nothing and spent 40 years making clothing so precise it outlasted the people who wore it. Fiona had inherited the shed, the sewing machines, and the notebooks full of her grandmother's observations about cloth, how linen behaved in humidity, how the grain of a fabric determined not just how it draped but how it aged, how a garment built to last required a kind of patience that most modern production couldn't afford. She had also inherited the debt. Her grandmother's house had needed a new roof, then a furnace, then work on the foundation. The repairs had consumed most of what a dressmaker in a small town could save over 20 years. And then her husband, Thomas, had died 3 years ago, quickly and without warning, a heart attack at 44, and Fiona had been left with Rosie, the shed, the debt, and a kind of grief that she had learned to carry the way you carried something very heavy for a very long time, by not putting it down. Because putting it down didn't actually make it lighter. The garment in her portfolio was what she had made instead of falling apart. It had taken 18 months. She had started it 6 weeks after Thomas died, in the shed at midnight when Rosie was asleep, because the alternative was sitting in the quiet of the house and waiting for the grief to stop feeling like drowning. Linen, hemp, and a reclaimed wool blend she had tracked down from a mill in Quebec's eastern townships. Every stitch hand-sewn, including the seams. The structure was based on her grandmother's techniques, but pushed further. A coat that looked simple from a distance and revealed itself slowly, the way certain things only showed their value to people who looked closely and knew what they were looking at. She hadn't entered any competitions before. She had almost not entered this one. "Mama," Rosie said quietly. "Is that her?" Fiona followed her daughter's gaze to the far end of the ballroom, where a small group had formed the particular constellation that meant someone important was at its center. The woman at the center of it was perhaps 38, with close-cropped dark hair and the upright posture of someone accustomed to being the most considered person in any room. She was dressed with the kind of deliberate restraint that communicated expense without advertising it. A charcoal blazer with an almost imperceptible check, a silk shirt open at the collar. Simone Archambault, CEO of Maison Archambault, the most commercially successful Canadian fashion house of the past decade. She had built the company from a two-person design studio in Montreal into an international label with distribution in 14 countries. The business press profiled her regularly. She had twice turned down offers to sell to European conglomerates, on the grounds that she didn't trust anyone else to maintain what she'd built. Fiona recognized her from a magazine she'd read in the waiting room of Rivière du Loup's only dental office. As if sensing something, Simone glanced up from the conversation she was leading. Her gaze moved across the ballroom with the efficient sweep of someone who had learned to assess a room quickly, and it landed on Fiona, briefly. Then it moved to the battered portfolio, then it moved on. But something made her look back. She said something to the man beside her, a word or two, low enough that Fiona couldn't hear, and then she walked over, not quickly, with the deliberate pace of someone who had decided something and was not in any hurry to be talked out of it. She stopped a few feet away. Up close, her expression was professionally neutral, but there was a particular quality to her attention, the kind that evaluated rather than merely observed. "Are you competing?" she asked. Her English carried the particular rhythm of someone whose first language was French. "Yes," Fiona said. Simone's gaze went to the portfolio again. "In which category?" "Artisan textile. Womenswear." Simone looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, but with an assessment that was thorough enough to be uncomfortable. "What are you showing?" "A coat materials. Linen, hemp, reclaimed wool from the eastern townships." Something shifted in Simone's expression. Not interest exactly, more a recalibration, as though a number she'd been expecting had come in slightly differently than projected. All natural fibers. Yes, hand-sewn, entirely. The neutrality didn't crack, but something behind it sharpened. That's an unusual choice for a competition at this level. The artisan category tends to reward innovation. Judges here are looking for something that moves the conversation forward, not back. "I think it does," Fiona said. Her voice was quiet and level. She had said the same thing to herself in the shed at 2 in the morning more times than she could count. Simone studied her for another moment. Then she looked down at Rosie, who had been watching this exchange with the unfiltered attention of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is impolite. "Your daughter?" "Yes." Simone held Rosie's gaze for a beat, then looked back at Fiona. "Well," she said, in a tone that managed to convey both professionalism and something that wasn't quite dismissal but was close enough to sting, "the panel will be thorough. I hope you're prepared for detailed questions." She walked back toward her group before Fiona could answer. Rosie watched her go. "She seems like she thinks she already knows things," she said. "She does know things, a lot of them. But not yours." Fiona looked down at her daughter. "No, not yet. They had 3 hours before the presentation." Fiona found a bench near the back of the hall and set the portfolio down carefully, and they ate the sandwiches she'd packed in a cooler bag from home, cheese and mustard on sourdough, the bread slightly compressed from the drive. Rosie ate and read a library book about freshwater ecosystems. Fiona reviewed the notes she'd written on index cards, the technical specifications she'd prepared for every design decision, every material choice, every structural detail of the coat. "You nervous?" Rosie asked without looking up from her book. "A little dad used to say nervous is good. It means something matters." The mention of Thomas moved through her the way it always did 3 years on. Sudden, clean, impossible to prepare for. She breathed through it. "He was right about that," she said. Rosie turned a page. "Then you must really care about this coat." "I do. So do I." Rosie said it matter-of-factly, like a thing that simply was. "I watched you make it." At 1:45, they made their way toward the presentation area. The artisan category was being held in one of the smaller conference rooms off the main hall, still formal, with a long judging table and good directional lighting, but scaled down from the main ballroom's production. 4 judges waited: a textile historian from McGill, a buyer from a major department chain, a sustainable fashion journalist whose work Fiona had read, and a retired couturier whose name she recognized from her grandmother's era. They looked up when she came in. The shift in their expressions was subtle but legible. Not quite the confusion she'd encountered at registration, more a careful professional neutrality that meant they were reserving judgment while privately adjusting expectations. "Mrs. Calloway," the textile historian said, consulting the schedule. "You're presenting a coat, is that correct?" "Yes." Hand-sewn natural fibers. No structural support, no interlining. The structure comes from the cut and the grain placement. A small silence. The buyer glanced at the journalist. That's an ambitious claim, the buyer said. Not hostile, but precise. The coat will demonstrate it, Fiona said. If I could have a moment to set up. She opened the portfolio and lifted the coat out carefully, the way you lifted something you'd been protecting for 18 months. Something that existed on the other side of grief and debt and 700 kilometers of winter driving. She hung it on the display hook they'd provided and stood back and let them look. The room went very quiet. The coat was the color of unbleached linen in certain light, neither white nor cream but something between them, warm and specific. It fell from the shoulders in a line that looked, at first, completely simple, clean, almost severe. But as the eye followed the line down, something happened. The drape shifted. The fabric moved differently at the hem than at the shoulder, not because of any seeming trick, but because of the grain. Fiona had cut each panel at a precise angle so that the natural movement of the fabric built through the length of the coat, creating a kind of visual weight at the hem that made it feel anchored without being heavy. The stitching was invisible from 3 feet away. From closer, it revealed itself as the real achievement. Even, patient, impossibly consistent, the kind of hand sewing that required years of practice and a particular quality of attention that couldn't be hurried. The textile historian stood up and walked toward it. "May I?" she asked. Fiona nodded. The woman lifted the hem and examined the seam. Then she looked at the underside of the collar. Then she examined the area under the arm, where the tension of most garments showed their compromises. "You cut this on the bias," she said. "It wasn't a question. On a modified bias. The center back is true bias. The side panels are cut 5 degrees off. Why 5 degrees? Because true bias on this weight of linen gives too much drape at the back and not enough support through the shoulder. 5 degrees off, you keep the movement without losing the line." The historian looked up. Something in her expression had changed. "Where did you learn this?" "My grandmother." "And then a lot of trial and error. Your grandmother was a dressmaker. For 40 years. She emigrated from Portugal. She didn't have access to formal training, so she developed her own approaches. Some of them I've never seen in any technical literature." The buyer had gotten up now and was examining the coat from the other side. The journalist had her notebook out. Even the retired couturier, who had sat with the composed stillness of someone who had seen everything twice, was leaning slightly forward. "Miss Calloway," the couturier said, "the seam finish at the lining edge, there's no lining." "Correct. But the inside is as finished as the outside. Yes, that doubles your construction time." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Fiona had thought about how to answer this question. She had rehearsed several versions on the drive from Rivière du Loup in the dark, while Rosie slept in the back and the highway unreeled through the headlights. "Because a coat that only looks good from the outside is only doing half the job," she said. "Whoever wears this will know it's finished inside. They might never show it to anyone, but they'll know. That matters." The couturier looked at her over his reading glasses for a long moment. Then he made a note on his tablet. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, technical and precise. Fiona answered all of them. The material sourcing, the pre-shrinkage process, the specific thread she'd used and why, the number of stitches per centimeter, and how she'd maintained that consistency across 18 months of intermittent work. She had the numbers memorized. She had the samples. She had the process photographs she'd taken at her daughter's insistence, because Rosie had decided early on that documentation was important and had started taking pictures on Fiona's phone every few weeks without being asked. When she left the presentation room, she found Rosie exactly where she'd left her, on the bench in the hallway, drawing something in a small sketchbook she carried everywhere. "How did it go?" They asked a lot of questions. "Is that good? I think so." Fiona sat down beside her. "What are you drawing?" Rosie tilted the sketchbook to show her. It was a coat. Fiona's coat, roughly rendered but recognizable, surrounded by a border of what appeared to be leaves and something that might have been the St. Lawrence River. "That's beautiful," Fiona said. She meant it. "It's for you." "For when you win? I haven't won yet, I know." Rosie went back to drawing. "I'm making it for when you do." The deliberations were scheduled to take 90 minutes. Fiona took Rosie to the hotel restaurant for soup because Rosie was starting to flag in cold air, and excitement depleted her faster than almost anything else. They sat in a corner booth and ate in the particular comfortable quiet of people who had spent enough time together that silence required no maintenance. Her phone buzzed twice during soup. Both times she let it go to voicemail. After they finished, walking back through the hotel lobby toward the ballroom, a woman fell into step beside her. Fiona recognized her from the morning. one of the assistants who had been with Simone Archambault's group. Miss Archambault would like a word, the woman said, if you have a moment. Fiona glanced at Rosie, who gave her a look of transparent suspicion. Where? Fiona asked. The terrace bar. It's quiet this time of day. Fiona considered it. Then, okay. Rosie, will you be all right here for a few minutes? I'll draw, Rosie said, already opening her sketchbook. But if she's mean to you, I want to know. The terrace bar was almost empty, two businessmen at one end with laptops open, and Simone Archambault at a corner table with a coffee she appeared to have barely touched. She stood when Fiona approached, which was a small thing that Fiona noticed. Thank you for coming, Simone said. Please sit. They sat. Simone looked at her coffee for a moment before speaking. I want to apologize for this morning, she said, with the directness of someone who had decided to say a difficult thing and intended to say it well. What I implied about your work, I hadn't seen it. I was making assumptions based on things that don't actually indicate quality. That was wrong of me. Fiona waited. There was clearly more. I watched part of your presentation through the window, Simone continued. I wasn't trying to. I was walking past and I stopped because I could see the coat, and then I couldn't leave. She paused. I've been in fashion for 15 years. I know when something is genuinely exceptional and when something is performing the idea of being exceptional. Your coat is actually exceptional. Thank you, Fiona said. I'm telling you this not as a compliment, Simone said, but as a warning. If you place in this competition, and I think you will, what comes next is going to be complicated. There are people in this industry who will try to acquire your techniques, your patterns, your approach, in ways that don't preserve what makes them valuable. They'll offer you contracts that look good until someone explains what's in the fine print. Some of them will try to scale what you do in ways that destroy it. Industrial reproduction of hand techniques is a category of lie that fashion has been telling for 30 years. Fiona studied her. You're telling me this why? Because I have a production team that has spent 4 years trying to approximate the structural techniques you're using, and we haven't gotten there. And because I saw you explain the 5-degree bias modification to the judges, and I understood what I was hearing, and I don't think the people who are going to approach you after this competition will understand what they're acquiring. Simone set her coffee cup down precisely. I'm not making you an offer right now. I want to be very clear about that. I'm telling you to have someone review any offer you receive before you sign it. I was planning to. Simone looked at her with something that recalibrated again, upward this time. Good. They were quiet for a moment. Through the terrace window, the afternoon light was going blue-gray over the Toronto skyline, the particular quality of Canadian winter light that made everything look like it was being held at a careful distance. Your daughter, Simone said. She was drawing in the hall. She draws everything. She's been documenting the coat since I started making it. How long ago was that? 18 months. About 6 weeks after my husband died. Simone was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her expression that wasn't pity, more like recognition, the look of someone who understood why a person might need a problem they could solve when everything else felt unsolvable. I'm sorry, she said. Thank you. Is that why you made it? The coat? Fiona thought about the shed at midnight, about the particular quality of silence after Rosie went to sleep, and how the grief lived in that silence, and how the only thing that helped was having something to do with her hands. About her grandmother's notebooks, about the specific feeling of cutting linen on a modified bias at 2 a.m. with the radio on low, and the way that feeling was the opposite of drowning. Partly, she said, and partly because my grandmother spent 40 years developing techniques that nobody ever properly documented, and she's been gone for 6 years, and it felt like letting that disappear would be a second loss I didn't want to sit with. Simone looked at her steadily. Then it should see the light. I think so too. They shook hands before Fiona went back to the hall. Simone's grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who meant the things they did with their body. Rosie had covered 2 pages of her sketchbook by the time Fiona came back. Was she mean? No. She was honest. Is that better? Usually, Fiona said, sitting down beside her. Usually it is. The judges returned to the ballroom at 4:30. The crowd that had gathered was larger than Fiona had expected. Word had apparently moved through the building during the deliberation period, the way news of anything unusual tends to move through a concentrated professional space. People were clustered near the front, designers, buyers, industry press, a few people whose lanyards identified them as sponsors. The lead judge, the textile historian, took the microphone. She began with the formal language of competition proceedings, thanking participants, acknowledging the judging criteria, noting the quality of this year's field. Fiona stood near the back with Rosie's hand in hers. Rosie had the sketchbook under her arm and was standing very straight, the way she stood when she was trying not to show that she was anxious. Before we announced the results, the historian said, "I want to say something about what this competition is for. It exists to recognize work that advances how we think about making, not just what we make, but how. The decisions embedded in a garment, the materials chosen, the construction method, the finishing, those are arguments. They make claims about what clothing is for, and who it serves, and how long it's meant to last." She paused. "In 15 years of judging competitions at this level, I have seen very few garments that made me stop and revise what I thought I knew. This year, the panel was unanimous. Rosie's hand tightened in Fiona's. The Meridian Prize in the Artisan Textile category goes to Fiona Calloway for a coat that represents a standard of construction we will be discussing for years." Rosie made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She threw her arms around Fiona's waist and held on with the specific force of a child who had been holding something in for a long time and was finally allowed to let it go. Fiona stood there with her arms around her daughter and tried to remember how to breathe. The applause came up around them, some of it generous, some of it polite, some of it from people who were already calculating what the announcement meant for them. She heard it all from a slight distance, the way sound comes when you're standing at the center of something and can't quite process that it's real. Someone guided her toward the front. She climbed the small platform. The historian shook her hand and said something close to her ear that Fiona would only remember later. "Work like this doesn't happen often. Take care of it." There was a trophy and a check, the prize, which was substantial enough that Fiona had not let herself think about what she would do with it, because thinking about it would have made the possibility too concrete to risk losing. She held both and looked out at the room and found in the third row Simone Archambault watching her with an expression that was not quite a smile but contained one somewhere inside it. Simone nodded. Fiona nodded back. The presentation wrapped up quickly after that. People moved toward her immediately. Industry contacts, a journalist wanting to quote 2 buyers who produced business cards, and the particular smooth urgency of people who wanted to establish connection before anyone else did. Fiona answered carefully, said less than she might have, gave no commitments. Robert Finch, the retired couturier, caught her arm as she was moving toward the exit. He was older than she'd thought up close, perhaps 70, with the unhurried quality of someone who measured time differently than most people. "You'll get a great deal of attention in the next few weeks," he said. "Some of it will be useful, and some of it will be predatory, and it can be difficult to tell the difference quickly. I'm beginning to understand that. The techniques you're using, your grandmother's approach, what you've developed from it, that's protectable. Not easily, and not cheaply. But you should speak to someone who specializes in artisanal intellectual property before you show your process documentation to anyone." Fiona thought of the process photographs on her phone, the index cards, the 18 months of notes she'd kept in a series of increasingly worn composition books. "Do you know someone?" He produced a card, a name Petra Delacroix, Cultural Heritage and Artisan IP Law, Montreal. She helped an artist I know protect a traditional printing process from industrial appropriation. She's tenacious and she's list. Fiona took the card. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Just be careful." He squeezed her arm once, lightly, then let go. "What you've made is important. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and don't let anyone take it from you because you weren't paying attention." She found Rosie near the door, sketchbook open, adding something to the drawing of the coat. The border of leaves had grown. The river was more defined. "You won," Rosie said without looking up. "I won. I knew you would." She closed the sketchbook with a small, decisive snap. "Can we get dinner somewhere nice?" "Not sandwiches from the cooler." "Yes," Fiona said. "Wherever you want." They ate at a small Italian place 3 blocks from the hotel. Nothing extravagant, but with tablecloths and candles on the table, and a waiter who brought Rosie a bowl of pasta that she ate with the focused satisfaction of a child who knew this was a special occasion. Fiona had wine, 1 glass. She sat and looked at her daughter and tried to take in the fact of the day. "Are things going to be different now?" Rosie asked between bites. "Some things. Not the important ones. Will we still go to the shed? Every weekend. Will you still teach me about grain and bias? When you want to learn." Rosie considered this while twirling pasta on her fork. "I want to learn all of it. What Grandma Rosa knew, what you know, everything. Then you will." Rosie nodded as though this were settled and went back to eating. Fiona looked out the restaurant window at the Toronto street, cold, lit in yellow and white, people moving past with their coats pulled up against the January air. She thought about the shed in Rivière-du-Loup, about the notebooks her grandmother had kept, About Thomas, who had never seen the finished coat, but whose presence was woven into 18 months of midnight sessions in ways she couldn't fully account for. She had made the coat because she needed something to hold on to, and it had turned out to be something extraordinary. She didn't entirely understand yet what the connection was between those two facts. Whether grief sharpened certain kinds of attention, whether needing something fiercely enough changed what you were capable of making. But she thought about it the way she thought about grain and bias, as a property of materials, something you could learn to understand and work with, even if you couldn't fully explain it. Her phone had collected 17 messages during dinner. She left them. On the drive home, which they'd start in the morning, after a real night's sleep in a hotel bed, Fiona would call Petra Delacroix. She would think carefully about what to protect and how. She would return exactly the calls that seemed worth returning and let the others go. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she watched Rosie eat pasta by candlelight and held the fact of the day gently, the way you held something that could still be startled away if you gripped it too hard. "Mama," Rosie said finally. She had a small amount of tomato sauce on her chin that she was either unaware of or unconcerned about. Yes, Dad would have liked today. The familiar sharpness moved through her. She let it. He would have liked it very much. He would have talked about the bias thing for weeks. Fiona laughed. A real laugh. The kind that came up before you could manage it. "You're right. He absolutely would have." Rosie smiled and reached across the table and took her mother's hand the way she'd learned to do in the hard months, when it helped to just be touching something real. They sat like that for a moment in a restaurant in Toronto, a long way from home, on the other side of a day that had changed something fundamental about what the next year would look like. The coat was still hanging in the presentation room. Fiona would collect it in the morning, pack it with the same care she'd packed it for the drive down, carry it home to Rivière-du-Loup, where it would go back on the dress form in the shed until she figured out what came next. But she already knew what the next project was. She had sketched it on index cards weeks ago in the margins of her technical notes. A second garment, different in character but related in spirit. Hemp and linen again, but structured differently, lighter, designed for a different kind of movement. Her grandmother had a technique for setting sleeves that nobody else, as far as Fiona could tell, had ever written down. She wanted to understand it fully. She wanted to push it somewhere new. She had a shed and a daughter who took photographs without being asked, and a grandmother's notebooks full of things worth knowing in time, now to do the work properly. The coat had been a beginning. It had also been a proof, not to the judges, or to Simone Archambault, or to anyone in that ballroom, but to herself, that the hardest years could be the years you built something good, that losing someone didn't have to mean losing the thread of your own life, that grief, if you gave it something to do with its hands, could be transformed into the kind of attention that made extraordinary things. Rosie squeezed her hand and let go, and picked up her fork and went back to the last of her pasta. Outside, Toronto went on being Toronto, wide and cold and lit from below, the way big Canadian cities are in January when the dark comes early and people keep moving anyway into whatever comes next.